The world is at a pivotal moment.
Geopolitical clashes have spawned an intense race for technology leadership.
Industries are being reshaped.
Globalization is being reimagined. I'm Andrew Schwartz.
And I'm Kirti Gupta. We're here to break down how geopolitics and technology are impacting our economy,
our security, and our daily lives. This is GeoTech Wars.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined with Orville Schell. Orville is the director of the Center on U.S. China Relations at Asia Society in New York, and he's the former professor and dean at the University of California, Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. He is an author of 15 books, and 10 of them are about China. Orville, you've really devoted your life to bringing the U.S. and China together. And you've reported on China for over 50 years and spent significant time in both China and Taiwan. Welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure.
In today's episode, I'd like to get into the U.S. foreign policy towards China and vice versa. Especially today, foreign policy influences trade, investment, technology. All of these things are held hostage over geopolitical considerations. Allow me to share some of your personal history with our listeners that's relevant. Your wife was Chinese, your children are half Chinese, you speak Mandarin fluently. You spent a lot of time in the country. You're really well positioned to speak about the current shifts in China within the country and U.S.-China relationship. Why has the U.S.-China relationship shifted so drastically in the last decade? What's driving this shift?
The question you posed really is the question of questions. And if you all recall, in 1972, when Kissinger and Nixon went to China, they in effect, although they didn't use the term, began engagement. And then, as you also recall, in 1979, Deng Xiaoping came to Washington, diplomatic relations were accorded between the United States and China. And then we entered this incredibly amazing period of the 1980s, when the countries drew closer and closer together. Reform and opening was the watchword of the day in China. And then, of course, alas, 1989 happened and the Beijing massacre. But nonetheless, engagement not only got restored afterwards under Jiang Zemin, but because, as you recall, engagement originally was an alliance of the U.S. and China against the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union had collapsed. So we needed a new reason to stay together. And so engagement kind of got re-cored and repurposed with the idea that greater interaction, business, trade, culture, science, technology, academic exchanges would bring us closer together. Strangely, we had 9 presidential administrations in the United States all supported this concept. So your question is, why did this end? This was a really good deal for China. They entered the global marketplace. They were trained in Australia, Canada, Britain, the United States, around the world. So what is it that made China decide that this was something that was ill-served it? And here, I do think, because it isn't a logical explanation to say it no longer served China. And I think we have to turn to the political personality of Xi Jinping. Put it in very simple terms, kind of grew up during the Cultural Revolution and never quite migrated out of the notion of Marxism, Leninism, which saw the United States and the liberal democratic capitalist world as fundamentally hostile to China. And so I think in some significant ways, the end of that epic period of engagement and globalization where China boomed and the world profited and nobody cared where their microchips, their automobiles, their blankets, their T-shirts were made, as long as it was made cheaply, came quickly, and didn't have to have big inventories. And that period, alas, has ended. It has ended predominantly because China felt it had a position of gained sufficient wealth and power not to have to sit at the feet of the West, and that Xi Jinping's fundamental nature wanted to be an equal leader, and yet as an autocrat and a Leninist, that was very difficult for the Western world to fully accept him. We've come to the end of an era. It's mysterious because it doesn't serve China well to kill engagement. It doesn't serve anyone in the world well to do that, and yet, here we are.
That's right. And, China, as you said, until recently has been a great beneficiary of doing so well in the globalized world. So there have to be some repercussions internally with this shift happening. What's the thinking in country? What's the reaction?
It depends on who you're speaking of. If you talk about professional classes, urban people, educated people, I think the reaction is very neuralgic and very adverse to what Xi Jinping has done, because in effect, he is cutting China off. It is China, not the West, that's decoupling first. And here I think Xi Jinping is revived very much an old Maoist notion. The People's Republic of China cannot afford to trust the democratic West. It's something that actually came out of the Qing dynasty as well, that somehow China needed to protect its own essential qualities, its own autonomy, its autarky. And you will recall one of the big principles of Maoist China was self-reliance. So that is where Xi wants to take China. Above all, he wants to be technologically self-reliant, and in worlds like microchips, AI, quantum, he wants China not to be dependent. But he does want, wherever possible, the West to be dependent on China markets. So he wants to create dependencies for the world on China, but he wants to diminish the dependency of China on outside worlds because he's fundamentally distrustful that the outside worlds think kindly of his form of autocratic Leninism and are not possibly just engaged in subversive regime change strategies.
It's always interesting for me to hear you take such a massive shift in your thinking. Like I said in your introduction, you devoted your life to bringing the two countries together, and you're kind of trying to share with us this not so hopeful picture of why there is this decoupling happening. So I'd like to go into the angle of technology in a minute and what we can do, but you seem to index a lot of this is about Xi Jinping and an understanding about what drives him, what motivates him. Why is that? And can you tell us more?
Well, it's partially about Xi Jinping as a leader who has big leader pretensions of the old style. I mean, more in the model of Stalin, Mao, the various leaders that ruled Eastern Europe, Kim Il-sung, Ho Chi Minh. But also, I think, in a certain sense, it's a very unsophisticated, uncosmopolitan leader who did not grow up like Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping and many other earlier communist leaders in China with experience in the West, even in Russia, America, France. Xi Jinping has had no experience outside of China. He does not speak a foreign language. And moreover, he came of age during the Cultural Revolution. I think we have to take into account the fact that even though China under Deng Xiaoping went through an extraordinary period of reform and opening and an economic boom, it never abandoned any of the structure of the Soviet Union, which it adopted in the 1950s. So the party remained in place, although diminished. And all of the structures of government, from the propaganda department, the United Front Office, all of these things remain. So when Xi Jinping came into power, the old structure of the Soviet Union, which China had borrowed under Mao in 1949, was still in place. And he re-articulated, he re-energized it. And his notion of what in Chinese is called fuxing, or rejuvenation, was to restore the old Soviet system and make China a power in its own right. His version of democracy is the dictatorship of the proletariat. And he says that is a form of democracy too. It should be respected and accepted. But the bitter reality is that the liberal democratic world and much of the rest of the world will not accept it. And so he's caught in a terrible bind. And I think this is where we find ourselves.
You talked about the aspiration to be technologically independent and self-reliant, and to the extent possible, have others depend on Chinese innovation. But Orville, to quote you, frankly, if there was ever the perfect metaphor for belonging to the global commons, it's technology, where global collaboration helps everybody. And it's actually hard to put barriers to innovation. They're artificial in many respects in today's globalized world. Code and open source and innovation and skill set and knowledge pass easily across nation states and borders. quite frankly, what is the strategy here to decouple? How likely is it?
Well, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to decouple because the whole presumption, which we've lived for 30 years, was the idea that globalism is win-win-win for everybody. And we did, in fact, build a global commons. And there was no aspect of that commons, which I think was more metaphoric of the way we were bound together than technology. Because some of the great researchers in our universities come from China and India and Europe and around the world. In a sense, we see the disruption not only of the global marketplace, but of the global research commons upon which technology depends. What's the consequence of that going to be? Well, I don't think we really know. But what we see is China trying to develop its own research commons, its own ability, and the West or the outside world, however you want to define it, will be, in a certain sense, deprived of Chinese inputs and of Chinese students who played an immensely important role in many of the STEM science research centers around the American world and around the world in general. So if the decoupling transcends just trade, but means that we separate too in terms of tech research commons, that is going to be a monumental canyon, which is going to be very difficult to bridge again.
And that has a downside for everybody, not just China, not just the United States.
Yes, not only a downside and a total disruption from a system which is working quite nicely, but it is also going to have a monumental effect on companies that are so globalized that they have to literally rip off arms and legs to readjust. I want to hasten to add here that it's not a foregone conclusion this will happen, but the trend lines don't look great. And if you look at what happened when Russia invaded the Ukraine, you can see how brutal decoupling can actually be. There's some companies that remained in Russia, but awful lot left, and they lost their shirts. So if something were to happen between China and, let's say, Taiwan or the South China Sea or wherever, we will see another kind of a further rupturing of this once global commons, which I think is going to be very, very difficult.
But, companies that are operating in the last 40 to 50 years all have very intricate, interdependent global supply chains. It isn't easy or immediate. It's not going to be a matter of a year or two to be able to disentangle from the global supply chain. There are so many advisors today that put managing geopolitical risk, managing the global supply chain, a top priority item for corporate directors. But it's still going to take time. And in that time, there can be disruption. Do we need to have a deterrence strategy to avoid or to delay a conflict?
My own view, Kirti, is that probably the best hope and the best strategy is deterrence, which would both perhaps deter China from doing something aggressive and particularly harmful in the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea or even in the Senkaku Islands that Japan administers, or in India on the border there. Remember, in India, Arunachal Pradesh, huge territory, is claimed by China. And in due course, they're going to do something about it, just as they have in Ladakh and Bhutan. So any number of these flashpoints could really disrupt the process of slow decoupling. And we have to remember that history is replete with examples. I would say the post-World War I, pre-World War II era, there was a lot of globalization, and yet it didn't stop the Nazis. So it is possible. And history, as I say, has many examples where, despite everybody's wishes and the interests of companies and their aspirations to somehow keep the global fabric together, it rips apart. And when it does, it can rip apart with terrible violence and terribly precipitously, and upend every corporate strategy that was ever devised. One hopes that doesn't happen.
That's a great point. The lesson from history, the pre-First World War era that we've all forgotten was the first era of globalization, the first wave of globalization where a lot of people were enjoying goods and trade from many different countries. And it did come to a limited halt with the First and ultimately the Second World War. And we might be at the beginning of that wave again, although it's a terrible consequence to consider.
It is. It's too frightening. And I think many companies are so frightened by it.
Yeah.
Because they don't know what to do. And understandably so, there isn't anything to be done. There is no strategy that can transcend such a precipitous tectonic eruption in the existing system. But again, I think what needs to be done by governments is to say, what's the best strategy to prevent these kinds of precipitous disruptions? Companies need to try to discern which way they think the wind is blowing, position themselves as well as they can, recognizing that there's no perfect solution. Even TSMC in Taiwan is in bed with China just as much as it is with the United States. And many, many companies are dependent on both for markets and many other things. So we are in a global fabric. And you mentioned that I grew up in this world of engagement. I did. And I thought it was wonderful when the U.S. and China were getting along all right. But that depended on the era of reform and opening in China. That was Deng Xiaoping's mantra. Reform and opening are over. China is not engaged in that anymore. So we lost the primary operating system for engagement. We don't have a new system except one that's increasingly adversarial and hostile. Let me add this too. I don't want to be completely despairing about China because China has an entirely different side. We've seen it over the last 100 years express itself again and again and again. And it is a more humanist side, a more open side, a side where it's more cosmopolitan, sophisticated, global, and there's so many incredibly bright, able, global Chinese, and they're there. And that tradition is there. If they can have the right kind of leadership, which they will have again at some point, it will re-express itself with a vengeance. We saw it in the 80s, and China did brilliant. It astounded the world with its accomplishments. Unfortunately, the world is not unacquainted with dictatorship. You know, we've had Mussolini, we've had Salazar, we've had Franco, we've had Stalin, we've had Hitler, we've had Mao Zedong, we've had Kim Il-sung. So these things happened in history. The global world had no idea how to deal with this.
And the other thing that happens that often change comes from within. And then we need to readjust. Chinese economy in the past has done really well. It has been the silver lining in the past global recessions, but no more. GDP growth is down to some official numbers say 4 or 5%, but it's widely understood that it's down to less than 2%. It's likely to remain low. Property slump, real decline in foreign direct investments, in trade is all hitting hard. In the meantime, we got to have a smart deterrent strategy. What does that look like for you?
At this point in history, I think the most sensible thing for us to do as a nation is to confederate as closely we can with allies, partners, and friends. And I don't just mean militarily. I mean technologically, economically, culturally, but at the same time, to use every diplomatic channel we can to keep channels open with China and to keep trying to have some interaction as much as we possibly can, both economically and otherwise. We have to bear in mind that China will change. How, we don't know. These forces that I suggested to you earlier that have existed historically are powerful and they are deep and they will re-express themselves again. We see flickers of it all the time, and you certainly see flickers of it in the hundreds of thousands of Chinese that are leaving China now and coming abroad. Talk to these people. You realize all is not well in China right now. That doesn't mean China doesn't have a lot of clout, a lot of ability, a lot of market share, a lot of strength. But what it means is there's a lot of disaffection as well. Things ultimately always do change. People live, people die, leaders come, leaders go. If you had asked me when I was in China in the mid-70s, when Mao Zedong was still alive and the Cultural Revolution was still going, if things would change, I would have said no. I didn't see a sign, a scintilla of evidence that it could change. And yet, a few years, it did, and it will.
Let me ask one last question. A lot of focus on the semiconductor value chain because that's a technology where we could potentially limit tech transfer. Unlike artificial intelligence, quantum compute, many other technologies where it's harder to limit knowledge transfer, tech transfer, software-based, open source-based models. It's harder to put artificial national barriers. Semiconductor chips is where it is very difficult to build a fab and a foundry. It takes over 10 years. It is difficult to get some specialized tools and ship them. There can be limitations placed. And they really do serve as a foundation for unleashing the power of other technologies. If you don't have semiconductor chips, you don't have compute, you don't have processing. A lot of focus on that right now from the United States as well and from China. How's that working out? Are we able to organize an effective deterrence strategy with partners and allies?
The so-called West, or the world outside of China, has a better chance of reorganizing its own ecology of microchips, from design to packaging, fabbing, the whole supply chain. But it'll be very difficult because we are dependent on China as a market as well. And China is dependent on the outside world, as you well know, for things like lithography machines, DUV, EUV machines from ASML, fabbing and TSMC in China, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the trend so far, and it could change, but I don't see signs of it yet, is greater and greater. It's like oil and water separating. China wants to be more self-sufficient. They're striving to develop their own capacities, and yet there are choke points that they are dependent on in the West. And one of them, of course, as you well know, is ASML in Holland. They create all the machines that create the high, lower nanometer range, leading-edge chips. And yet there are ways along. We're in a difficult moment when we can't quite decide whether we want to try to divorce or maintain the relationship somehow, if possible. And it's a very awkward period because people are running in both directions at once, but everybody is dependent on everybody else. And microchips here, as you pointed out, is the metaphor for globalization. And yet the political trends do not look good for this global commons to maintain itself as it has. And now we see with the CHIPS Act and companies around the world, from Japan to SK Hynix, Samsung in Korea, and various companies that make solvents and gases that are needed in the microchip process, and TSMC. Everybody is scratching their heads and say, where do we run? How do we deal with the new world if it actually is a warning? And if that new world is increasing separation from China and decoupling, how do we do that without damaging ourselves and fatally, perhaps ruining our own tech ecologies and companies?
And I think what's happening in semiconductors is really tip of the spear, harbinger of other industries going to have to face very similar issues. I mean, semiconductors is really at the forefront, but others aren't really far behind. So for me, the takeaway from this conversation is really managing the supply chain, managing the geopolitical risk. Companies need to start the process of disentangling, not knowing how long it's going to take, and B, really having smoother deterrence strategy from a policy perspective, because we need time. We just need more time.
The primary focus is to try to figure out which way do you think the winds are blowing. And then companies have to do the best they can in the time they have before anything happens which pushes them precipitously and quickly to rearrange themselves as best they can. It's a daunting challenge. But again, history is replete with daunting challenges that nobody wanted, nobody was ready for, nobody welcomed.
It's an important reminder. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, for your insights. I hope that we have this conversation again in a year or so, and it will be more positive.
Well, it was a great pleasure, Kirti. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into GeoTech Wars. You can listen to more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you listen to great content.
Don't forget to rate and review us. Until next time.